At 6:15 a.m., Margaret Jenkins pushed open the heavy glass doors of Sterling Tower, the tallest building in the city. The lobby was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. She'd worked here for nearly 9 years as part of the cleaning staff, long enough to know the sound of every flickering light, the smell of every freshly polished surface, and the subtle way the building woke up before its people did. Her cart rattled slightly as she wheeled it to the private elevator that led to the 38th floor, the top floor, reserved for Sterling Dynamics executives. Few people from the cleaning crew ever set foot up there. Margaret did, because she'd earned the trust of the CEO himself, Charles Whitman. He was a man everyone admired from afar, but rarely approached. Margaret didn't know him well, but over the years, she'd learned one thing. He was always precise, punctual, and unshakably energetic. That morning, however, when the elevator doors opened the pristine executive lobby, Margaret immediately sensed something was off. She started her routine, dusting the reception desk, wiping the coffee table in the waiting area, but her eyes kept drifting toward the glass-walled corner office at the far end. Charles was already there, hunched over his desk, but his posture was unusual. His shoulders slumped forward as if weighed down, and when he reached for a pen, his hand trembled slightly. Margaret frowned. She'd seen something like that before, years ago, when her late husband had suffered a minor stroke at work. The tremor, the stiffness, the pale complexion. It was subtle, but it was there. She paused in the hallway, her dust cloth in hand. Should she say something? It wasn't her place. She was a cleaning lady, and most people didn't appreciate unsolicited concern, especially powerful men like Charles Whitman. But as she watched him try to stand and straighten his jacket, only to lean heavily on the desk for balance, her heart started to pound. Margaret tapped lightly on the open door. "Morning, Mr. Whitman. Everything all right?" she asked in her warm, even voice. He glanced up, startled. "Oh, Margaret." "Yes, I'm fine," he said quickly, though his voice sounded slightly slurred. "Just a bit tired." She nodded politely, but inside, alarms were going off. His left cheek looked faintly drooped, and his speech wasn't as crisp as usual. The signs were too familiar to ignore. "Sir, forgive me for saying, but I think you might not just be tired," she said carefully. "You may be having—" He waved her off with a weak chuckle. "Margaret, I appreciate the concern, but I have an important meeting in 20 minutes. Really, I'm fine." But Margaret didn't believe him. She could feel that deep, urgent pull in her gut, the one that told her this was serious. She'd lost her husband because people ignored the early signs. She wasn't about to stand by and watch it happen again. Her mind was already racing, weighing her options. If she was wrong, she'd look foolish. If she was right and did nothing, he might not make it through the day. She stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "Mr. Whitman, I think you need a doctor. Now!" Charles blinked at her, as if trying to process her words. "A doctor? Margaret, She cut him off gently but decisively. "Sir, please. I'm not saying this lightly. I've seen this before. My husband, he didn't make it because no one acted fast enough." The seriousness in her voice made him pause. Still, pride flickered in his eyes. "I can't cancel this meeting. It's been on the calendar for months." Margaret took a step closer, lowering her voice. "If I'm right, and you wait, there might not be a next meeting." He stared at her, searching for a sign she was exaggerating. But she stood there, steady, sincere, and unwilling to back down. Finally, he sighed. "All right, I'll humor you. Call the nurse from HR. She's had some medical training." Margaret didn't waste a second. She strode out into the hall, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, and picked up the executive desk phone. She dialed HR, her voice urgent. "This is Margaret Jenkins from the 38th floor. I need someone with medical training now. Mr. Whitman isn't well." Within minutes, Laura from HR arrived, carrying a first aid kit. She was young, efficient, and visibly startled to see the CO leaning heavily against his desk. "Mr. Whitman, can you smile for me?" Laura asked quickly. He tried, but the left corner of his mouth barely moved. Margaret's heart clenched. She'd been right. Laura exchanged a sharp glance with her. We need to call 911. This could be a stroke. Charles muttered something about overreacting, but Laura had already picked up the phone. Margaret stepped to his side, steadying him as his balance faltered. The paramedics arrived in less than 10 minutes, their calm but swift movements filling the office. One of them, a tall man with a kind face, asked, "When did the symptoms start?" Margaret spoke before Charles could. "I noticed them about 15 minutes ago, but I think they may have started earlier." His hand was trembling when I came in. They nodded and moved quickly, checking his vitals, administering oxygen, and preparing the stretcher. Charles looked bewildered, as if the day had spun out of his control. "Sir," one paramedic said firmly, "you're lucky she noticed. We need to get you to the hospital immediately." As they wheeled him toward the elevator, Charles caught Margaret's eye. His face was pale, but there was something else in his gaze, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. The elevator doors closed, and the floor felt strangely quiet. Laura let out a breath she'd been holding. "You probably just saved his life," she told Margaret softly. Margaret shook her head. "I just couldn't ignore it. Not again." She cleaned in silence for the next hour, her mind replaying the scene. She didn't know what would happen to Charles Whitman, but she knew she'd done the right thing. What she didn't know was at this moment, the one she almost talked herself out of, was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. The rest of the day felt strangely hollow on the 38th floor. Charles's usually bustling office stood empty, his leather chair turned slightly to the side as if he'd just stepped out for a moment. But the truth weighed heavier. Margaret had no idea if he was even conscious anymore. By late afternoon, the rumors had started trickling in. An intern whispered to another near the break room, "I heard Mr. Whitman collapsed in the ambulance." Someone else claimed he was already in surgery. Margaret kept her head down, polishing the glass doors, but her ears caught every word. Her phone buzzed around 4:30 p.m. It was a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then answered. "Margaret Jenkins?" a voice asked. "Yes." "This is Dr. Reynolds from St. Michael's Hospital. You were with Charles Whitman this morning." Her heart thumped. "Yes, sir. I wanted you to know you acted quickly. He was having an ischemic stroke. If you hadn't spoken up, the damage could have been much worse. We managed to treat him in time, and he's already responding well." Margaret exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "So he's going to be all right?" "With some rest and rehab, yes. And he's asking to see you." That caught her off guard. "Me? Are you sure?" The doctor chuckled. "Pretty sure. He's been insisting since he woke up." An hour later, Margaret found herself in a quiet, private hospital room. The steady beep of a heart monitor filled the air. Charles lay in bed, looking pale but alert, a faint smile tugging at the right side of his mouth. "Margaret," he rasped, "you really don't waste time, do you?" She smiled back, relief washing over her. "I wasn't about to let you just brush it off." He studied her for a long moment. "You know, in my position, people are usually too scared to tell me something I don't want to hear. They nod, they agree, they stay out of my way. You didn't." Margaret shrugged. "When it comes to health, pride doesn't mean much. I've seen what happens when people stay quiet." His gaze softened. "I owe you my life." "You don't owe me anything," she said gently. "Just take care of yourself." But Charles didn't seem convinced. He glanced toward the window, as if mulling over a thought. "Still, I think I do owe you, and not just words." Margaret wasn't sure what he meant, but before she could ask, a nurse came in to check his floor. She excused herself, saying she'd visit again once he was more rested. As she left the hospital, the evening air felt cool against her skin. She thought about what he'd said, about owing her. She didn't expect anything, but a part of her wondered if Charles Whitman was the kind of man who kept his word. She was about to find out. 2 weeks passed before Margaret saw Charles again. In that time, the building buzzed with speculation about his health. Most employees had no idea how close they had come to losing their CEO. The official company memo simply said he was recovering from a medical issue, but Margaret knew the truth, and so did Laura from HR. On a Tuesday morning, Margaret was scrubbing the marble floor in the executive lobby when the private elevator dinged open. Out stepped Charles Whitman, walking a little slower than before, a cane in his right hand. His suit was perfectly tailored, but there was a new softness in his expression. "Margaret," he greeted warmly. She stood up straight, surprised. "Mr. Whitman, you're back." "Not officially," he said with a faint smile. "Doctor says I should still be at home, but I had something important to take care of." Before she could respond, he handed her a cream-colored envelope. She opened it carefully, revealing a formal letter printed on Sterling Dynamics letterhead. It read, "Effective immediately, Margaret Jenkins is promoted to Executive Facilities Coordinator, with expanded responsibilities and a substantial salary increase. This promotion recognizes her outstanding service, attention to detail, and, above all, her life-saving actions on March 14th. Margaret blinked at the words, certain she'd misread them. "Mr. Whitman, this is too much." "No, it's not enough," he said firmly. "You saw what no one else did. You spoke up when you could have stayed silent. People like you are the backbone of this company, and it's about time you were treated like it." Her throat tightened. She'd worked for nearly a decade without so much as a raise beyond inflation. The idea that someone at his level had not only noticed her work, but valued it. It was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep telling me the truth," he replied with a half-smile, "even when I don't want to hear it." She laughed lightly, nodding. "You can count on that." The rest of the day felt surreal. Her new position meant she'd have her own small office, better hours, and benefits she'd never had before. But more than the promotion, it was the respect behind it that stayed with her. That evening, as she was leaving the building, she overheard two junior executives talking. "Why do you think the CEO is so fond of her?" One asked. The other shrugged. "Maybe she's just lucky." Margaret smiled to herself. It wasn't luck. It was paying attention when no one else did. What she didn't know was that this act of attention, of courage, was about to ripple far beyond her own life, because Charles Whitman had a way of turning gratitude into action. And the next step he had in mind would make headlines. 3 days later, Margaret was called to the 38th floor earlier than usual. She assumed Charles needed something in his office, but when she stepped out of the elevator, she froze. The lobby was filled with cameras, reporters, and a backdrop bearing the Sterling Dynamics logo. A company PR assistant hurried over. "Margaret, you're here." "Good. Mr. Whitman's been waiting for you." Confused, she followed the assistant into the main conference room. Dozens of employees stood around, whispering. Charles was at the podium, leaning on his cane, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Margaret," he said into the microphone, "please join me up here." Every head turned. Margaret felt her cheeks flush as she walked to the front. Charles rested a hand on her shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen, 2 weeks ago, this woman saved my life. I didn't want to make that public at first. It felt personal. But then I realized something. Her actions are a lesson to all of us." Margaret noticed something everyone else missed. She spoke up when it would have been easier to stay quiet. And that courage is worth honoring. The room was silent, except for the clicking of cameras. "That's why," Charles continued, "Sterling Dynamics is launching the Jenkins Initiative, an employee health and wellness program dedicated to early detection, training, and awareness. Every employee will receive medical screening and education so that we can recognize warning signs in ourselves and in each other. Because sometimes the person who saved your life isn't a doctor. It's someone who cares enough to see you." Applause erupted. Margaret stood there, stunned. She had expected a quiet thank you, maybe a handshake. But this was something bigger. When the clapping died down, Charles turned to her again. "Margaret, I can never repay you. But I hope this initiative carries forward what you did for me, saving lives through awareness and courage." She found her voice. "I just did what anyone should do," she said softly into the microphone. "Pay attention. Care. It doesn't matter what your job title is. You could be the one who makes a difference." The applause came again, louder this time. Margaret could see some of the reporters scribbling notes, others snapping close-up shots of her face. By the end of the day, local news outlets had already picked up the story. Headlines read, Cleaning Lady Saves CEO's Life. Company launches major health initiative in her honor. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives she hadn't spoken to in years. But in the middle of all the excitement, Margaret stayed grounded. This wasn't about fame. It was about the quiet decision she'd made that morning to speak up, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that life was about to change even more. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's life shifted in ways she hadn't imagined. She was no longer just the cleaning lady to anyone in the building. Colleagues stopped in the hall to greet her, managers invited her to lunch, and new hires recognized her from the story they'd read online. The Jenkins initiative rolled out faster than expected. Nurses and medical trainers began visiting the building weekly, offering screenings and short workshops. Margaret was invited to sit in on the first one, where the trainer talked about the very symptoms she had spotted in Charles that day. As she listened, she felt a quiet pride, knowing that people here might one day save a life because of what she had done. One afternoon, Charles stopped by her new office. "You've been busy," he said with a smile. "I've been learning," she replied. "Turns out there's a lot more to health awareness than I realized." He nodded. "That's the point. We're all learning. And for what it's worth, Margaret, you've changed this company in a way I never could." She shook her head. "All I did was pay attention." "Exactly," he said. "And that's what most people fail to do." A month later, a letter arrived at her home from the city mayor's office, inviting her to a public recognition ceremony. Standing on stage at City Hall, Margaret listened as the mayor recounted her story to a packed audience. "It's not wealth or power that saves lives. It's compassion and action," he said. Margaret Jenkins is living proof. She received a framed certificate and a standing ovation, but the best part came afterward, when a young woman approached her in tears. "My dad had a stroke last year," she said. "I wish someone had been there for him, like you were for your boss. Thank you for making people pay attention." That night, Margaret sat in her quiet kitchen, certificate propped against the wall, thinking about everything that had happened. She hadn't set out to change anyone's life. She had only wanted to stop history from repeating itself. But somehow, that single choice had sparked something far bigger. Weeks turned into months, and the attention eventually faded from the headlines. But inside Sterling Tower, the culture had shifted permanently. People looked out for one another more. They asked questions. They noticed. And every morning, when Margaret walked into the building, she felt the same determination she had that day, eyes open, mind alert, ready to speak up if something wasn't right. Because now she knew for certain. You never know when simply paying attention might be the difference between losing someone forever and giving them a second chance at life.